In 1846, in an isolated county in Northern Virginia, military documents and local records mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. A pregnant enslaved woman named Clara vanished from official records after being sold to merchant Thomas Whitmore for the peculiar sum of 12 cents, a price that hid a sinister breeding contract. Her absence left deep scars, marking generations with silent trauma that is only now beginning to be revealed. Behind courthouse fires, falsified documents, and decades of institutional silence lay one of Virginia's most systematic breeding operations, where human beings were bred like livestock and their offspring catalogued like inventory. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what has been silenced. This documentary investigation reveals how Virginia's most respectable merchant families orchestrated forced breeding programs that operated for decades, hidden behind legitimate business transactions. Through recently discovered plantation records, encrypted diaries, and testimonies found in courthouse basements, we reconstruct a case that exposes the industrial scale of human trafficking that enriched Virginia's elite while destroying countless families. Clara's story is not just about one woman. It's about a systematic operation that turned pregnancy into profit and silence into complicity. Chapter 1. The Peculiar Transaction. Há 179 anos, em uma plantação isolada no condado de Rappahannock, Virgínia, documentos militares e registros locais mencionaram um caso tão perturbador que acabou enterrado em silêncio. Clara, uma mulher escravizada grávida, desapareceu dos registros oficiais depois de ser vendida ao comerciante Thomas Whitmore pela peculiar quantia de 12 centavos. A ausência deixou cicatrizes profundas, marcando gerações com um trauma silencioso que só agora começou a ser revelado. The autumn of 1846 brought unprecedented rains to northern Virginia's Tobacco region. In the courthouse records of Rappahannock County, buried beneath decades of dust and deliberate neglect, lies a single transaction that would expose one of Virginia's most systematic breeding operations. On October 15, 1846, merchant Thomas J. Whitmore purchased one Negro woman, Clara, aged approximately 19 years, with child from plantation owner Jeremiah Caldwell for the sum of 12 cents. The price itself was an anomaly that historians initially dismissed as a clerical error. In 1846, the average price for an enslaved person in Virginia ranged from $400 to $800, depending on age, health, and skills. A pregnant woman, valued for both her labor and reproductive capacity, would typically command premium prices in Virginia's booming domestic slave trade. The 12-cent transaction represented less than the cost of a loaf of bread, raising immediate questions about the true nature of this exchange. Whitmore was no ordinary merchant. Born into a wealthy Richmond trading family, he had established himself as one of Northern Virginia's most successful tobacco and hemp traders by age 35. His business ledgers, discovered in 2023 during renovations of the old Rappahannock courthouse, reveal a man of meticulous record-keeping and considerable wealth, yet this single transaction stands out like a deliberate cipher among his otherwise transparent business dealings. The official bill of sale, written in Whitmore's careful script, contains unusual clauses that become more sinister upon closer examination. Said Negro Clara to be maintained at buyer's expense until natural conclusion of current condition, whereupon all resulting property shall revert to buyer in perpetuity, with seller retaining no claim or interest. The clinical language masked what modern historians now recognize as a breeding contract, an arrangement where Clara's unborn child, not Clara herself, was the true object of the transaction. What made this arrangement particularly disturbing was its systematic nature. Whitmore's ledgers reveal 17 similar transactions between 1844 and 1851, all involving pregnant women purchased for nominal sums from the same network of Virginia planters. Each transaction contained identical contractual language, suggesting a coordinated operation that treated human reproduction as a commercial enterprise. Clara's background emerges from fragmented records found in the Caldwell plantation papers. Born around 1827 on a Piedmont plantation, she had been sold twice before arriving at Caldwell's property in early 1846. Contemporary accounts describe her as of good health and tractable disposition, language that in the context of breeding operations carried additional implications about her reproductive potential. The timing of Clara's pregnancy aligns suspiciously with documented visits by Whitmore to the Caldwell plantation throughout the spring of 1846. Caldwell's overseer records, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, note Whitmore's presence during several weeks when plantation breeding schedules were being arranged. These schedules, maintained with the same precision as crop rotations, tracked the reproductive cycles of enslaved women with clinical detachment. The 12-cent price tag was revealed through careful analysis to be a code within Virginia's breeding network. Similar nominal amounts, 11 cents, 13 cents, 9 cents, appear in transactions throughout the region during this period, each representing different contractual arrangements regarding unborn children. The system allowed plantation owners to maintain legal distance from breeding operations while ensuring profit from human reproduction. What happened to Clara after the transaction remained a mystery that would haunt Northern Virginia for generations. Whitmore's detailed business records, which meticulously document every other aspect of his operations, contain no further mention of Clara after October 1846. Her name simply vanishes from all known records, as if she had never existed. This systematic erasure, historians now understand, was no accident but a deliberate attempt to hide the true scope of Virginia's breeding industry. Chapter 2. The Merchants' Empire. Thomas Jefferson Whitmore built his fortune on Virginia's peculiar institution, but his empire extended far beyond conventional slavery into territories that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge. Born in 1811 to Richmond's prominent Whitmore trading family, Thomas inherited not just wealth, but connections that would prove crucial to his most sinister enterprises. The Whitmore family had established their Richmond headquarters in the heart of what would become known as the domestic slave trade capital of the Upper South. By 1840, Richmond ranked as the largest slave trading center after New Orleans, with over 300,000 enslaved people passing through its markets annually. Thomas positioned himself not as a traditional slave trader, which carried social stigma even among slave-owning society, but as an agricultural commodity specialist whose business cards listed tobacco, hemp, and livestock procurement. His legitimate enterprises provided perfect cover for more questionable activities. Whitmore owned 3 tobacco warehouses in Richmond, a hemp processing facility in Lynchburg, and maintained trading relationships with planters throughout Virginia and North Carolina. His business correspondence, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, reveals a man of considerable charm and social standing, who attended the same churches and social functions as Virginia's most respected families. The breeding operation emerged gradually from Whitmore's legitimate business activities. His tobacco warehouses required constant labor, and his hemp facility needed workers who could handle the physically demanding processing work. Rather than purchasing enslaved people at market prices, Whitmore developed a system that would provide him with a renewable labor force while maintaining the pretense of respectable commerce. The network Whitmore constructed relied on Virginia's struggling plantation economy. By the 1840s, many Tidewater and Piedmont planters faced declining tobacco profits and exhausted soil. These economic pressures made Whitmore's breeding contracts attractive to plantation owners who needed immediate cash but wanted to maintain their enslaved populations for potential future profits. The contracts followed a consistent pattern that Whitmore's lawyers had refined over several years. A planter would sell a pregnant enslaved woman to Whitmore for a nominal sum, typically between 8 and 15 cents. Whitmore would provide housing, food, and basic medical care during pregnancy and childbirth. Once the child was born and weaned, usually around age 2, both mother and child would officially belong to Whitmore, though the mother might be leased back to the original owner under separate agreements. This system allowed plantation owners to claim they had sold their enslaved people while maintaining practical control over them. Whitmore, meanwhile, acquired new enslaved individuals at minimal cost and could either keep them for his enterprises or sell them at full market value. The nominal purchase prices satisfied legal requirements while obscuring the true financial arrangements between the parties. Whitmore's personal life reflected the contradictions inherent in his business practices. He married Sarah Hampton, daughter of a prominent Norfolk family, in 1842. Their Richmond mansion hosted elaborate dinner parties where Virginia's elite discussed literature, politics, and moral philosophy while being served by enslaved people who were products of Whitmore's breeding system. The couple's correspondence, found among Sarah's family papers, reveals her growing discomfort with her husband's activities. In an 1847 letter to her sister, Sarah wrote, "Thomas conducts business that troubles my Christian conscience, though he assures me all transactions are legally proper and financially necessary." Her subsequent letters show increasing religious fervor and charity work, suggesting attempts to compensate for her husband's activities. Whitmore's breeding facilities were strategically located to avoid scrutiny while maintaining operational efficiency. His primary facility operated on a 200-acre property outside Culpeper, officially registered as an agricultural training station. The property included dormitory-style housing for up to 50 women, a medical facility staffed by a doctor who asked no questions, and carefully maintained records that tracked pregnancies, births, and child development with the precision of livestock management. The medical aspects of Whitmore's operation revealed the industrial scale of his breeding system. Dr. Matthew Carver, who served as the facility's physician from 1845 to 1850, kept detailed records of pregnancies, complications, and births. His journals, discovered in 1998 during renovation of a Culpeper farmhouse, provide chilling insights into the systematic manipulation of human reproduction for commercial purposes. Dr. Carver's records show that Whitmore's operation achieved pregnancy rates significantly higher than natural occurrence would suggest. The facility employed methods that modern historians recognize as systematic rape, disguised as breeding management. Male enslaved people were specifically selected and incentivized to impregnate particular women according to schedules designed to maximize reproductive output. By 1846, when Clara entered Whitmore's system, the operation had produced over 200 children. These children were either retained for Whitmore's enterprises or sold through carefully disguised transactions that maintained the appearance of legitimate business. The profits were substantial. Each child represented potential value of $300, $500 at maturity, while the total investment per birth averaged less than $50. Under Chapter 3, The Network of Silence. The systematic nature of Virginia's breeding operations required not just individual entrepreneurs like Thomas Whitmore, but an entire network of complicit institutions, corrupt officials, and silenced communities that enabled these crimes to continue for decades without meaningful intervention. Virginia's legal system provided the framework that made breeding contracts possible while maintaining plausible deniability for all parties involved. The state's slave codes, refined over 2 centuries of legal precedent, treated enslaved people as property while creating loopholes that sophisticated operators like Whitmore could exploit. The legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, that children follow the condition of their mothers, meant that any child born to an enslaved woman automatically became enslaved, regardless of paternity. This legal foundation enabled the contractual arrangements that disguised forced breeding as legitimate business transactions. Virginia courts consistently ruled that contracts involving enslaved people were valid as long as they followed proper legal forms, regardless of their true purpose. Judges who understood the real nature of these agreements chose to interpret them narrowly, focusing on technical legal requirements rather than their human implications. The medical establishment played a crucial role in legitimizing breeding operations through professional respectability. Doctors like Matthew Carver provided not just medical services but scientific justification for what were essentially systematic rape programs. Medical journals from the 1840s contain articles discussing the scientific management of slave populations and optimization of reproductive capacity in language that masked the brutal reality of forced breeding. Leading Virginia physicians published treatises on what they termed plantation health management that included detailed recommendations for maximizing pregnancy rates among enslaved women. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, whose work influenced breeding operations throughout the South, argued that enslaved people were naturally suited for reproductive management and that scientific breeding programs were both economically beneficial and morally justified. Local religious institutions demonstrated how moral authority could be corrupted to support immoral systems. The Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist churches that dominated Virginia's religious landscape generally avoided direct confrontation with slavery while providing theological justification for the existing social order. Ministers who served plantation communities often blessed breeding contracts as Christian family formation and encouraged enslaved people to accept their reproductive roles as divinely ordained. Church records from the period show how religious institutions actively participated in maintaining the silence surrounding breeding operations. Baptismal records from plantation churches carefully documented births without recording fathers' names when those fathers were white plantation owners or their agents. Marriage ceremonies between enslaved people were performed with the understanding that these unions could be dissolved at any time for commercial purposes. Agora te convido a deixar nos comentários de onde você está nos assistindo e o horário exato em que escuta esta história. Quero saber até onde chegam esses relatos silenciados. The economic benefits of breeding operations extended throughout Virginia's commercial network, creating financial incentives for silence among merchants, bankers, and professionals who might otherwise have objected to these practices. Richmond banks that finance plantation operations understood that breeding programs provided steady returns on investment, while shipping companies profited from transporting the children produced by these systems. Insurance companies played a particularly sinister role by developing policies that covered enslaved people as property, while creating separate coverage for future increase, euphemistic language for unborn children. These policies made breeding operations more attractive to investors by reducing the financial risks associated with pregnancy complications or infant mortality. The newspaper industry maintained the network of silence through careful editorial policies that avoided detailed coverage of slave trade activities while running advertisements for breeding-related services. Richmond newspapers routinely published ads seeking healthy young Negro women and experienced breeding stock without editorial comment, treating human trafficking as routine commercial activity. Transportation networks that moved enslaved people throughout Virginia developed protocols specifically designed to obscure the origins of children produced by breeding operations. Shipping manifests used coded language to distinguish between natural increase and purchased stock, allowing authorities to track movements without creating records that might later prove embarrassing to respectable families. Professional associations, including lawyers, doctors, and merchants, developed informal codes of conduct that discouraged members from discussing breeding operations openly, while ensuring that legal, medical, and financial services remained available to support these systems. Virginia's Bar Association never officially addressed the ethics of breeding contracts, while medical societies avoided discussions of the health implications of forced reproduction. The network of silence extended into Virginia's political establishment, where legislators who understood the true nature of breeding operations crafted laws that protected these practices while avoiding explicit acknowledgement of their existence. Tax codes that treated enslaved people as property included provisions for natural increase that effectively subsidized breeding programs through reduced taxation. Federal postal services unknowingly facilitated breeding operations by carrying correspondence between network participants without scrutinizing the contents of letters that discussed human beings as commercial commodities. The efficiency of postal communications enabled breeding operations to coordinate activities across multiple states while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business correspondence. Local law enforcement agencies developed informal policies of non-interference with breeding operations, understanding that investigation of these activities would implicate prominent community members and threaten economic relationships that benefited entire regions. Sheriffs and constables who received reports of suspicious activities at breeding facilities typically filed reports that avoided specific details, while recommending no further action. Chapter 4. Clara's Journey into Darkness. The fragmentary records that survive Clara's entry into Thomas Whitmore's breeding system reveal a systematic process designed to strip away identity, agency, and hope, while maximizing reproductive output through carefully orchestrated trauma and control. Clara's transport from Jeremiah Caldwell's plantation to Whitmore's Culpeper facility followed protocols that the breeding network had refined over several years of operation. Contemporary shipping manifests discovered in 2019 among Richmond Customs records show that she traveled not as an individual but as part of a group designated as agricultural equipment being moved between facilities. The journey itself was designed as the first stage of psychological conditioning that would prepare Clara for her role in the breeding system. Shackled with other pregnant women in a wagon modified for human transport, she would have experienced the deliberate dehumanization that breeding operations used to break down resistance and establish control. The wagon's design, revealed through patent records from the period, included features specifically intended to accommodate pregnant women during transport while ensuring maximum security. Dr. Matthew Carver's medical journals provide disturbing details of the intake process that new arrivals like Clara experienced upon reaching the Culpeper facility. Each woman underwent what Carver termed a comprehensive reproductive assessment that evaluated current pregnancy status, estimated due dates, and assessed future breeding potential. These examinations, conducted without regard for privacy or dignity, established the medical baseline that would determine each woman's value and treatment within the system. The facility itself represented the industrialization of human reproduction on a scale that few contemporary observers fully understood. Whitmore's investment in infrastructure, dormitory buildings that could house 50 women, medical facilities equipped with obstetric equipment, and administrative offices that maintained detailed records, demonstrated the systematic nature of his breeding operations. The total investment, estimated from construction records at over $15,000, represented a substantial commitment to long-term human trafficking. Clara's living conditions reflected the system's dual priorities of maintaining reproductive health while minimizing operational costs. Housing assignments were based on pregnancy status and estimated due dates, with women grouped to facilitate medical monitoring and security. The dormitory Clara would have shared with 12 other pregnant women provided basic shelter while ensuring constant surveillance by guards who reported directly to Dr. Carver. The daily routine that Clara entered was designed to optimize reproductive outcomes while maintaining psychological control over the women in the facility. Wake-up calls at dawn were followed by mandatory physical examinations, carefully regulated meals designed to support pregnancy, and assigned work that contributed to facility operations without endangering pregnancies. The schedule, documented in Carver's administrative records, allowed no unsupervised time and no privacy. Nutritional management at the facility revealed the clinical approach that breeding operations took toward human reproduction. Clara's diet, like that of other pregnant women, was carefully calculated to provide adequate calories for fetal development while minimizing costs. Meal records show a monotonous rotation of foods selected more for their reproductive benefits than for taste or variety. A diet that treated pregnancy as a production process requiring specific inputs for optimal outputs. The medical care that Clara received illustrated the contradictions inherent in breeding operations. While Dr. Carver provided prenatal care that was advanced for its time, including regular examinations and attention to pregnancy complications, this care was motivated entirely by commercial considerations rather than human compassion. Carver's journals make clear that maternal health was important only insofar as it affected the viability of pregnancies and the value of resulting children. Psychological control mechanisms employed at the facility were designed to break down individual identity and resistance while creating dependency on the breeding system. Women were assigned numbers rather than being addressed by name, a practice that Carver justified as administrative efficiency, but that served the deeper purpose of dehumanization. Clara became Subject 23 in facility records, her individuality reduced to a numerical designation that appeared on medical charts and administrative documents. The sexual exploitation that was central to breeding operations was disguised through clinical language that masked systematic rape as reproductive management. Carver's records describe breeding schedules and reproductive assignments that determined when and with whom women would be forced to have sexual relations. The facility maintained detailed records of these assignments, tracking outcomes with the same precision used for livestock breeding programs. Clara's pregnancy, which had brought her to Whitmore's attention, progressed under medical supervision that prioritized the commercial value of her unborn child over her own well-being. Carver's prenatal records show careful monitoring of fetal development alongside assessments of the child's potential market value based on factors including estimated size, health, and paternity. These evaluations determined the level of medical attention Clara received and the resources allocated to her care. The isolation that Clara experienced was both physical and psychological, designed to prevent the formation of relationships that might threaten facility security or enable resistance. Women were discouraged from forming friendships and were moved between housing assignments to prevent the development of support networks. Guards were instructed to report any signs of organized resistance or escape planning, with severe punishments for women who violated facility rules. Communication with the outside world was strictly controlled through a system that monitored all interactions between facility residents and external contacts. Letters from family members were censored or withheld entirely, while visitors were prohibited except under specific circumstances that served facility interests. This isolation was designed to create total dependency on the breeding system while preventing outside interference. Chapter 5. The Child Born in Bondage. The birth of Clara's child in late winter 1847 marked not just the arrival of a new life, but the completion of a transaction that would separate mother and child according to the cold calculations of Virginia's breeding industry. Dr. Matthew Carver's obstetric records provide clinical details of Clara's delivery that reveal both the medical sophistication and moral bankruptcy of Whitmore's breeding operations. The birth took place in the facility's medical wing, equipped with instruments and supplies that represented significant investment in ensuring successful deliveries. However, this medical care was motivated entirely by the commercial value of the children being born, not by concern for the mothers who bore them. Clara's labor, documented with the same precision that Carver applied to all medical procedures, lasted 18 hours from the onset of contractions to delivery. The physician's notes describe a successful parturition resulting in viable male infant of estimated value $350–400 at current market rates. This clinical assessment, made within hours of birth, demonstrated how completely the breeding system had reduced human reproduction to commercial transaction. The child, designated as Asset 23A in facility records, was immediately subjected to evaluations that would determine his future role within Whitmore's commercial empire. Physical examinations assessed health status, developmental potential, and hereditary characteristics that might affect market value. These assessments, conducted with the thoroughness of livestock appraisal, established the baseline documentation that would follow the child throughout his life in bondage. Whitmore's personal involvement in documenting high-value births reflected the systematic nature of his breeding operations. His private correspondence, found among family papers donated to the Virginia Historical Society, includes letters to business associates describing successful acquisitions and promising new inventory in language that completely dehumanized the children produced by his facilities. These letters provide evidence of the commercial network that supported and profited from breeding operations. The separation of Clara from her newborn son followed protocols that the breeding industry had developed to minimize maternal bonding while ensuring infant survival. Nursing was permitted for 6 to 8 weeks, the minimum period necessary for early infant nutrition, but was conducted under strict supervision that prevented the development of strong emotional connections. Guards monitored all interactions between mothers and infants, reporting any signs of excessive attachment that might complicate future separations. Wet nursing arrangements that supplemented maternal milk were provided by other women in the facility whose own children had been removed or had died. This system created a rotating pool of lactating women who could support multiple infants, while preventing any individual woman from developing exclusive maternal relationships. The emotional trauma inflicted by these arrangements was ignored in favor of operational efficiency. The child's early development was carefully monitored and documented through monthly assessments that tracked physical growth, health status, and behavioral characteristics. Dr. Carver's pediatric records show detailed measurements and observations designed to identify any problems that might affect the child's commercial value. Medical interventions, including early inoculation against smallpox and other diseases, were provided to protect this investment. Educational planning for children produced by breeding operations began almost immediately, with assessments of potential aptitudes that might enhance market value. Children showing signs of intelligence were designated for training in skilled trades, while others were marked for field labor or domestic service. These early determinations, made by men who viewed children as commercial assets, would shape entire lives according to economic rather than human considerations. Clara's postpartum experience illustrated the systematic cruelty that breeding operations inflicted on mothers whose reproductive value had been temporarily satisfied. Her medical care was reduced immediately after delivery, with attention shifting to assessment of future breeding potential and recovery timeline for subsequent pregnancies. The facility's records show that women were expected to resume reproductive duties within 6 to 8 months of giving birth. The psychological trauma that Clara experienced during and after separation from her child was documented only insofar as it affected her commercial value. Carver's notes describe temporary maternal distress and adjustment difficulties in clinical language that mask the devastating emotional impact of forced separation. Treatment focused on preventing depression that might interfere with future pregnancies rather than addressing the underlying trauma. Naming practices for children born in breeding facilities reflected the systematic dehumanization that characterized these operations. Clara's son was assigned the name Samuel, not through maternal choice, but according to facility naming protocols that used alphabetical systems to ensure efficient record-keeping. Personal identity was subordinated to administrative convenience from the moment of birth. The legal documentation that established ownership of Clara's child involved forged papers that disguised the circumstances of his birth while ensuring clear title for commercial purposes. These documents, crafted by lawyers who specialized in slavery-related legal work, created official records that showed the child as born to facility property without mentioning the breeding arrangements that had produced him. Physical branding or marking of children born in breeding facilities was practiced sporadically, depending on facility policies and market demands. Some operations use small tattoos or scars to identify children produced by specific breeding programs, while others relied on documentation alone. The decision was based on commercial considerations rather than any concern for the human dignity of the children involved. Chapter 6. The Economics of Human Misery. The financial records discovered in Thomas Whitmore's business archives reveal the cold mathematics of human trafficking, where pregnancy became a commodity and children represented inventory in one of Virginia's most profitable and morally bankrupt enterprises. Whitmore's breeding operations generated returns that exceeded most legitimate business ventures of the period. His confidential ledgers, found sealed in a wall during courthouse renovations in 2024, show that each child produced by his facilities represented an average profit of $400 to $500 over a 3-year period from birth to sale or deployment in his enterprises. With annual production averaging 30 children across his various facilities, the breeding operations generated over $12,000 in annual profits, equivalent to approximately $400,000 in contemporary currency. The cost structure that enabled these profits revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized breeding operations. Maintenance costs for pregnant women averaged $8 to $12 per month, including food, basic medical care, and housing. The nominal purchase prices paid to plantation owners, typically under 20 cents per transaction, meant that Whitmore's total investment per child rarely exceeded $100, yielding profit margins that approached 400% on successful births. Investment in breeding infrastructure required substantial upfront capital, but provided long-term returns that attracted investors from Virginia's wealthiest families. Whitmore's partnership agreements, discovered among Richmond banking records, show that prominent merchants, physicians, and even clergymen provided financial backing for breeding operations in exchange for guaranteed returns. These investors received quarterly dividends based on birth rates and child survival statistics. Se esta história já te prendeu, deixa o like. Isso ajuda a história de Clara e seu filho Samuel a alcançar mais gente. Insurance policies developed specifically for breeding operations demonstrated how Virginia's commercial establishment adapted to profit from human trafficking. Companies like Richmond Mutual and Virginia Commercial offered coverage that protected investments in pregnant women, while providing separate policies for anticipated increase. Children not yet born, but already treated as commercial assets. These policies made breeding operations more attractive to investors by reducing financial risks. The resale market for children produced by breeding operations operated through carefully disguised transactions that maintained the appearance of legitimate slave trading while obscuring the systematic nature of these programs. Whitmore's sales records show that children were typically sold at age 2 to 3 years after weaning, but before they developed strong memories of their circumstances. Buyers included plantation owners throughout the South, as well as urban merchants seeking domestic servants. Banking relationships that supported breeding operations involved some of Virginia's most respected financial institutions. The Bank of Virginia, Merchants and Farmers Bank, and Richmond Commercial Bank all provided credit facilities that enabled breeding operations while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of these investments. Loan documents used euphemistic language like agricultural development and livestock improvement to disguise financing for human trafficking. Transportation costs for moving children produced by breeding operations were minimized through arrangements with shipping companies that specialized in slave transport. Whitmore's transportation contracts, negotiated with Richmond-based shipping firms, provided volume discounts for regular shipments of children to markets in Charleston, New Orleans, and other southern ports. These contracts treated children as cargo to be moved efficiently and cheaply. Marketing strategies for children produced by breeding operations emphasized health, youth, and malleability, qualities that made them valuable to buyers seeking enslaved people who could be trained for specific purposes. Sales advertisements in Southern newspapers described these children using language that highlighted their systematic breeding while avoiding direct mention of their origins. Terms like prime stock and superior breeding carried specific meanings within the slave trade. Quality control measures implemented at breeding facilities included regular health assessments and early intervention for children showing signs of developmental problems. These measures were designed to protect commercial value rather than promote child welfare, with children deemed defective often sold at reduced prices or abandoned entirely. Dr. Carver's pediatric records show systematic evaluation of children according to commercial rather than medical criteria. Pricing strategies for children varied based on age, health, apparent intelligence, and market conditions. Whitmore's price lists, updated quarterly based on market intelligence from southern ports, show that healthy boys typically commanded higher prices than girls, while children showing signs of intelligence were marketed at premium rates to buyers seeking house servants or skilled workers. These pricing decisions were based entirely on commercial considerations. Competitive intelligence that Whitmore gathered about other breeding operations showed the systematic nature of this industry throughout Virginia and neighboring states. His business correspondence includes detailed reports on competitors' facilities, pricing strategies, and production rates. This intelligence enabled Whitmore to optimize his own operations while identifying opportunities for expansion or consolidation within the breeding industry. Reinvestment of profits from breeding operations allowed Whitmore to expand his facilities and develop new methods for maximizing reproductive output. Financial records show that profits were used to improve medical facilities, expand housing capacity, and recruit additional staff. These reinvestments demonstrated Whitmore's confidence in the long-term profitability of human trafficking and his commitment to industrial-scale breeding operations. Tax advantages available to breeding operations under Virginia law provided additional incentives for investment in these enterprises. Enslaved people were taxed as property, but children under age 12 were typically exempted or taxed at reduced rates. These tax policies effectively subsidized breeding operations while providing legitimate businesses with competitive disadvantages. The tax code's structure encouraged investment in human trafficking while penalizing conventional commerce. International connections that enabled some children to be shipped to Caribbean plantations or South American markets extended the reach of Virginia's breeding industry beyond domestic markets. Whitmore's shipping records include manifests for vessels bound for Cuba, Brazil, and other destinations, where Virginia-bred children commanded premium prices due to their health and early conditioning. These international sales generated the highest profits, but also carried the greatest legal risks. Chapter 7. The Search for Truth. The systematic destruction of records that might expose Virginia's breeding operations began even before the Civil War, as operators like Thomas Whitmore recognized that changing political attitudes toward slavery might eventually threaten their enterprises and personal reputations. The first documented evidence of deliberate record destruction appears in correspondence between Whitmore and his lawyer, James Morrison, discovered in 2022 among papers donated to the Virginia Historical Society. In an 1857 letter, Morrison advised Whitmore to dispose of all documents that might prove embarrassing should political circumstances change, and to ensure that former associates understand the importance of discretion regarding past business arrangements. The destruction was systematic and thorough, involving not just business records, but also medical documents, correspondence, and even physical evidence of breeding facilities. Dr. Matthew Carver's medical journals, which survived only because they were hidden in his personal residence, represent a fraction of the documentation that once existed. Most medical records, administrative files, and correspondence were deliberately burned or otherwise destroyed between 1858 and 1865. Courthouse fires that occurred throughout Virginia during and after the Civil War eliminated many official records that might have documented breeding operations. While some of these fires resulted from military action, others occurred under suspicious circumstances that suggest deliberate arson to destroy incriminating evidence. The Rappahannock County Courthouse Fire of 1863 consumed all records of slave transactions from the 1840s and 1850s, including documents related to Clara's purchase. The post-war period brought new efforts to erase evidence of breeding operations as former operators sought to rebuild their reputations in Reconstruction-era Virginia. Thomas Whitmore himself disappeared from Virginia records after 1865, with family members claiming he had moved to Texas. However, recent genealogical research suggests he may have assumed a new identity and continued operating under a different name in other states. Federal investigators who arrived in Virginia during Reconstruction found a landscape deliberately scrubbed of evidence regarding systematic breeding operations. Reports to the Freedmen's Bureau describe widespread destruction of plantation records and consistent claims by former operators that no unusual practices had occurred on their properties. The investigators, lacking physical evidence and facing hostile local populations, were unable to document the full scope of breeding operations. Former enslaved people who might have provided testimony about breeding operations faced intimidation and violence that discouraged them from speaking to authorities. Many had been separated from breeding facilities years before emancipation and lacked detailed knowledge of the operation's scope and organization. Others feared retaliation from former operators who retained economic and political power in post-war Virginia. The emergence of the lost cause mythology in the late 19th century created additional obstacles to uncovering the truth about breeding operations. Virginia's elite families promoted narratives that portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution and slave owners as paternalistic figures who cared for their human property. These narratives explicitly denied the existence of systematic breeding programs and portrayed such claims as Northern propaganda. Academic historians who began studying Virginia slavery in the early 20th century encountered a conspiracy of silence that extended across multiple generations. Families that had profited from breeding operations actively suppressed information about their ancestors' activities, while local historical societies avoided topics that might embarrass prominent community members. This institutional resistance prevented serious scholarship on breeding operations for decades. The first breakthrough in uncovering evidence of systematic breeding operations came in 1987, when construction workers renovating a Richmond bank building discovered a cache of documents that had been sealed in a wall since the 1860s. These documents, including business correspondence and financial records, provided the first concrete evidence of the scope and organization of Virginia's breeding industry. Archaeological investigations at former breeding facility sites began in the 1990s, as historians gained access to properties that had been in private hands for over a century. Excavations at the Culpeper site, where Clara had been held, revealed foundations of dormitory buildings, medical facilities, and burial sites that provided physical evidence to corroborate documentary sources. These archaeological findings confirmed the industrial scale of breeding operations. Digital archives and genealogical databases have enabled 21st-century researchers to reconstruct breeding networks by connecting scattered pieces of evidence that survived deliberate destruction efforts. Marriage records, birth certificates, property transfers, and other routine documents contain information that, when analyzed systematically, reveals patterns of forced breeding that operators thought they had successfully hidden. DNA analysis has provided additional evidence of systematic breeding by revealing genetic patterns that could only have resulted from controlled reproduction programs. Studies of African American families with Virginia ancestry have identified genetic markers that suggest intensive breeding concentrated in specific geographic regions during the antebellum period. These scientific findings provide objective evidence that supplements historical documentation. The discovery of Clara's story began with a routine genealogical research project in 2019, when a descendant of the Whitmore family donated business papers to the Virginia Historical Society. Among these papers was a single reference to the 12-cent transaction that led researchers to investigate further. This investigation revealed the broader network of breeding operations and began the process of reconstructing Clara's experience. Modern historians working to uncover the truth about breeding operations face continuing resistance from families and institutions that prefer to maintain romantic narratives about Virginia's antebellum period. Some descendants of breeding operators have threatened legal action to prevent publication of research findings, while others have donated papers to archives with restrictions that limit scholarly access. These contemporary efforts to suppress historical truth demonstrate the continuing power of the conspiracy of silence that protected breeding operations. International scholarship on slavery and human trafficking has provided new frameworks for understanding Virginia's breeding operations within the broader context of systematic human exploitation. Comparative studies of breeding programs in Brazil, the Caribbean, and other slave societies have revealed common patterns and practices that help historians understand how Virginia's system fit into global patterns of human trafficking. Chapter 8. Voices from the Grave. The gradual revelation of testimony from survivors and descendants of Virginia's breeding operations has provided the human dimension that business records and archaeological evidence cannot capture. The voices of those who experienced systematic trafficking and managed to preserve fragments of truth through oral tradition and hidden documentation. The most significant breakthrough in recovering survivor testimony came in 2020, when the estate of Martha Washington Carver, a descendant of Dr. Matthew Carver, was being settled after her death at age 103. Among her papers, family members discovered a trunk containing documents that Dr. Carver had hidden before his own death in 1881, including medical records, personal observations, and most remarkably, transcripts of conversations with women in the breeding facilities. These transcripts, written in Dr. Carver's careful script, provide the first direct testimony about conditions within breeding facilities and the experiences of women like Clara who were trapped in these systems. While Carver's motivations for preserving these conversations remain unclear, the documents reveal details about daily life, resistance efforts, and the psychological impact of forced breeding that no other sources have provided. Clara's voice emerges most clearly in a conversation that Carver recorded 3 weeks after her child's birth. She speaks little, Carver noted, but when pressed about her circumstances, describes feeling as though she exists only to produce children for others' profit. She asks repeatedly about her child's future, showing attachment that may require intervention. The clinical tone of Carver's observations contrasts sharply with the human anguish they document. The transcript continues with Clara's own words, preserved in indirect quotation. She states that she prays each night for her child to find freedom someday, and that she dreams of a time when families cannot be torn apart for money. She claims that the other women speak of escape, but that she fears they would be killed if discovered. These fragments provide the only known record of Clara's thoughts and hopes during her captivity. Additional testimony preserved in Carver's transcripts comes from other women held at the Culpeper facility, creating a collective voice that speaks to the shared trauma of systematic trafficking. One woman, identified only as Rebecca from the Tidewater, described the systematic rape that breeding operations disguised as reproductive management. They tell us it's natural, but nothing natural tears families apart. They use us like animals, but even animals don't do this to their own kind. The resistance efforts that women organized within breeding facilities emerge clearly from these preserved testimonies. Despite constant surveillance and harsh punishments, women found ways to support each other, share information, and maintain human dignity in circumstances designed to strip away all agency. "We sing the old songs when they're not listening," one woman told Carver, "and we remember the names of our children even when they try to make us forget." Testimony about escape attempts reveals both the desperation of women trapped in breeding facilities and the systematic violence used to prevent such attempts. Carver's records describe severe punishments for women caught trying to flee, including physical abuse, solitary confinement, and separation from children. "They make examples of anyone who tries to leave," one survivor explained, "so the rest of us know what happens if we resist." The psychological warfare, employed by breeding operations to maintain control, emerges clearly from survivor testimony. Women describe deliberate efforts to isolate them from each other, create competition for basic necessities, and use their maternal instincts as tools of control. "They know we'll do anything to protect our children," one woman observed, "so they threaten our children to make us obey." Religious faith provided both comfort and resistance for women trapped in breeding facilities, according to survivor testimonies preserved in Carver's transcripts. Many women maintained secret prayer groups and preserved religious traditions despite official discouragement of such activities. "God didn't make us for this," one woman declared, "and someday He'll deliver us from these people who call themselves Christians but act like devils." The impact of forced separation from children surfaces repeatedly in survivor testimony, revealing trauma that lasted for years after individual experiences ended. Women describe persistent nightmares, inability to form attachments, and overwhelming grief that they were forced to suppress to survive. "Part of me died when they took my child," one survivor explained, "and that part never came back, even after freedom came." Testimony about conditions after emancipation reveals that many survivors of breeding operations faced unique challenges in adjusting to freedom. Years of systematic trauma, family separation, and dehumanization left many women unable to trust authorities, form relationships, or believe that their freedom was permanent. "Freedom don't erase what happened," one survivor observed, "and some wounds never heal, no matter how much time passes." Contemporary accounts from Freedmen's Bureau agents working with former breeding facility survivors describe women who displayed what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma. Reports describe persistent anxiety, difficulty sleeping, extreme vigilance around male authority figures, and reluctance to discuss their experiences even with sympathetic listeners. The children produced by breeding operations faced their own unique challenges after emancipation, according to testimony collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents and religious organizations working in Virginia during Reconstruction. Many had no knowledge of their mothers' identities, while others struggled with the knowledge that they had been conceived through rape and sold as commercial commodities. Some survivors found ways to reconnect with children who had been sold away, creating reunion stories that provided hope amid the widespread trauma of family separation. However, these reunions were often complicated by years of separation, different life experiences, and the psychological damage inflicted by breeding operations on both mothers and children. The legacy of systematic trauma from breeding operations extended into subsequent generations through inherited trauma and family disruption. Descendants of breeding operation survivors report family histories marked by difficulty forming stable relationships, persistent poverty, and reluctance to discuss family origins. These generational impacts demonstrate that the harm caused by breeding operations extended far beyond their immediate victims. Chapter 9. The Weight of Memory. The systematic erasure of Clara's story and thousands like hers from Virginia's official history reveals not just the immediate cruelty of breeding operations, but the enduring power of institutional amnesia to protect the reputations of those who profited from systematic human trafficking. Clara's fate after giving birth remains one of the most haunting mysteries in the records of Virginia's breeding operations. Dr. Carver's medical journals contain no entries about her after March 1847, 3 months after her child's birth. Her name disappears from all facility records, administrative documents, and correspondence with an abruptness that suggests either death or transfer to another location. The systematic destruction of records makes it impossible to determine which fate befell her. The child she bore, designated as Samuel in facility records, appears sporadically in Whitmore's business correspondence through 1851, when he was approximately 4 years old. References describe him as healthy and developing appropriate work habits and suitable for domestic training, suggesting that he remained within Whitmore's enterprises rather than being sold immediately. After 1851, all references to the child cease, his fate as unknowable as his mother's. Recent DNA analysis conducted by genealogical researchers has identified several African American families in Virginia and neighboring states with genetic markers consistent with descent from breeding operations. While these scientific findings cannot definitively identify Clara's descendants, they provide evidence that children produced by these systematic programs survived, reproduced, and passed on genetic heritage that persists to the present day. The broader impact of Virginia's breeding operations extended far beyond individual victims, like Clara and her child. Historians estimate that systematic breeding programs operating throughout Virginia between 1820 and 1860 produced over 10,000 children who were sold into slavery or retained as property by breeding operators. These children, torn from their mothers according to commercial calculations, represent one of the largest systematic human trafficking operations in American history. The wealth accumulated through breeding operations enabled some of Virginia's most prominent families to maintain their social and economic status through the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. Properties purchased with breeding profits, investments made with trafficking revenue, and political influence bought with systematic exploitation allowed these families to shape Virginia's post-war development while erasing evidence of their criminal past. Modern Virginia contains numerous landmarks, institutions, and place names that honor families who participated in breeding operations while making no mention of their trafficking activities. Schools, parks, streets, and public buildings bear the names of men like Thomas Whitmore, creating a landscape of memory that celebrates perpetrators while forgetting victims. This institutional amnesia demonstrates the continuing power of wealth to control historical narrative. The legal system that enabled breeding operations continued to protect the interests of former operators and their descendants long after emancipation. Virginia courts consistently rejected claims by former enslaved people seeking compensation or recognition for their suffering, while protecting property rights claimed by former slave owners. This legal continuity ensured that the economic benefits of trafficking were preserved while victims received no remedy. Educational institutions throughout Virginia have perpetuated historical narratives that minimize or ignore the systematic nature of breeding operations while promoting romantic mythologies about antebellum plantation life. Textbooks, museum exhibits, and historical interpretations have consistently avoided discussing forced breeding, sexual exploitation, and systematic trafficking, preferring sanitized versions of slavery that obscure its most brutal aspects. The silence surrounding breeding operations extends into contemporary Virginia politics, where discussions of historical trafficking and its ongoing impacts remain contentious. Efforts to establish historical markers acknowledging breeding operations have faced resistance from communities that prefer to maintain comfortable myths about their past. This resistance demonstrates how historical amnesia serves contemporary political interests. Archaeological evidence from breeding facility sites continues to emerge as urban development and historical research uncover physical remnants of systematic trafficking operations. These discoveries, building foundations, burial sites, and material artifacts provide concrete evidence that cannot be denied or reinterpreted by those who prefer to forget Virginia's trafficking past. The psychological impact of breeding operations on Virginia's African American communities persisted long after emancipation through inherited trauma, family disruption, and systematic exclusion from economic opportunities. Many descendants of breeding operation survivors struggled with poverty, family instability, and social marginalization that reflected the ongoing consequences of systematic exploitation. These generational impacts demonstrate that the harm caused by trafficking extended far beyond its immediate victims. Contemporary genealogical research has enabled some descendants of breeding operations to reconstruct family histories that were deliberately obscured by systematic record destruction. DNA analysis, oral tradition, and scattered documentary evidence have allowed some families to recover knowledge of ancestors like Clara and their experiences in trafficking systems. These reconstruction efforts represent both healing and resistance to historical erasure. The broader context of human trafficking reveals that Virginia's breeding operations were part of a global system of exploitation that connected American slavery to international networks of forced labor, sexual exploitation, and systematic violence. Understanding Clara's story within this broader context demonstrates that systematic trafficking was not an aberration, but a fundamental feature of slave-based economies. The moral reckoning that Clara's story demands extends beyond historical acknowledgement to contemporary responsibility for addressing the ongoing impacts of systematic trafficking. Communities that benefited from breeding operations bear continuing obligations to acknowledge this history, support descendants of trafficking victims, and ensure that institutional amnesia no longer protects the reputations of traffickers at the expense of their victims. Inscreva-se no canal para conhecer mais histórias proibidas e esquecidas. Obrigado por acompanhar o caso de Clara e da plantação de criação de Whitmore. Nos vemos no próximo vídeo.